I learned something the day I became Ethan Romano's wife. The most dangerous lies are the ones that look exactly like fairy tales. Every magazine in New York called us the perfect couple. Every newspaper printed photographs of us smiling beneath crystal chandeliers. Our hands intertwined as if we'd spent years memorizing each other's touch, instead of rehearsing it for cameras. They admired my white silk gown, the custom diamond ring, the billionaire's mansion overlooking the Hudson River, and the quiet confidence of the man standing beside me. They never questioned why the bride smiled with hope, while the groom smiled with calculation. Maybe I didn't question it enough either. 3 months earlier, I was just Claire Bennett, a 30-year-old elementary school art teacher renting a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic that rattled every time I crossed the Williamsburg Bridge. My biggest worries were overdue student supply requests, rising rent, and whether my fourth graders would finally finish the mural we'd been painting since September. Ethan Romano lived in a different universe. His tailored suits fit like they had been stitched onto him. His watches probably cost more than my college tuition. His name carried a strange kind of gravity that made powerful people lower their voices whenever he entered a room. Officially, he was an investor with interests across Manhattan. Unofficially, nobody ever explained why security followed him everywhere, or why politicians seemed eager to shake his hand before quickly stepping aside. The first time we met, he didn't smile. He simply studied me with those impossible gray eyes, as if searching for an answer hidden beneath ordinary skin. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly across the polished conference table, "I need someone the world will believe." I almost laughed because I thought it had to be some elaborate mistake. Instead, I listened as attorneys explained confidentiality agreements, thicker than any textbook I had ever assigned, financial terms that sounded unreal, and one sentence that changed the direction of my life forever. A temporary marriage. 12 months. Public appearances. Absolute discretion. At the end, we would quietly separate, and I would receive enough money to fund every art program in my school district for years. I should have walked away. Every reasonable instinct whispered that people like Ethan Romano never made simple offers. But then he looked directly at me and said something no contract contained. "No one will force you. If you say no, you'll leave here exactly as you arrived." That mattered, not because it erased the mystery surrounding him, but because for the first time in weeks, someone offered me a choice instead of another impossible bill to pay. So I signed. The wedding happened inside a historic cathedral on a bright Saturday morning, with television cameras waiting outside and white roses lining every aisle. My closest friends cried because they believed I had found the love story every little girl imagined. Ethan remained composed through every vow, every photograph, every dance, speaking with perfect courtesy, yet careful distance. He never embarrassed me. He never ignored me. He simply treated me like someone precious he refused to hold too tightly. I convinced myself that kindness could become affection, if given enough time. Maybe this strange arrangement would slowly transform into something neither of us expected. Hope has a quiet voice. It survives on tiny moments. The way he always opened the passenger door before I climbed into the SUV. The way he remembered I hated sparkling water and replaced it with iced tea before every event. The way he noticed when my heels hurt and shortened public appearances without ever mentioning why. None of it felt romantic, but none of it felt fake either. By the beginning of our 4th month together, even I had started forgetting our marriage was built on paper instead of promises. Standing beside him during another glittering charity gala at the Grand Regent Hotel, watching camera flashes bounce across marble floors and golden ceilings, I caught my reflection beside his in a towering window. For one fragile heartbeat, we actually looked like a husband and wife. I didn't know someone else inside that ballroom had already decided to test how real our marriage truly was. The Grand Regent Hotel always smelled like polished marble, fresh lilies, and money that had existed for generations. I smiled until my cheeks ached, while photographers called our names from every direction, their camera flashes turning the ballroom into a storm of white light. Ethan stood beside me, exactly as he always did, calm, composed, one hand resting lightly against the small of my back, just long enough for every photograph to sell the same story. To everyone watching, we looked effortless. To me, Every public appearance still felt like walking across a frozen lake, wondering if the next step would finally crack the surface beneath us. Guests drifted around us, carrying crystal glasses and discussing investments, charity foundations, and summer homes in the Hamptons. A string quartet filled the room with soft music that echoed beneath ceilings covered in gold leaf. Ethan was introduced to senators, executives, and philanthropists, as though he belonged to every one of their worlds at the same time. I followed half a step behind, shaking hands, accepting compliments, thanking strangers for congratulating us on our marriage. More than once, women leaned close enough to whisper that I was the luckiest woman in Manhattan. I always smiled politely because explaining the truth would have sounded far less believable than the fantasy they preferred. After nearly an hour, one of Ethan's senior advisors approached him with unusual urgency. His expression never changed, but I noticed the subtle shift in Ethan's posture. He turned toward me with the same courteous smile he used for every camera. "Excuse me for a few minutes," he said quietly. "Stay inside the ballroom." I nodded without asking questions. It had become one of the unspoken rules of our arrangement. Sometimes people wanted private conversations with Ethan, and sometimes I pretended not to notice. I wandered toward a long balcony overlooking the river, grateful for a moment away from endless introductions. The cool evening breeze slipped through the open doors, carrying the distant sound of traffic below. I watched ferries crossing the dark water, while absent-mindedly tracing the edge of my wedding ring. For reasons I could not explain, I smiled. Maybe because the city looked peaceful, from 40 stories above the streets. Maybe because for one impossible second I imagined this marriage continuing long after the contract expired. Voices interrupted my thoughts. They came from the library just beyond the balcony, separated only by partially closed double doors. I recognized Ethan immediately. His voice was calm, lower than usual, almost emotionless. Another man spoke first. "The board believes your wife is becoming more than a convincing performance." A brief silence followed. Then Ethan answered without hesitation. "She is just my cover wife." The words landed harder than any shout ever could. My fingers stopped moving. Even the wind seemed to disappear. The advisor chuckled softly. "Good. Emotions create expensive mistakes." Ethan replied so quietly that I almost missed it. "That will never be a problem." I could not breathe. My heartbeat echoed inside my ears, louder than the music from the ballroom. Every memory I had carefully collected over the past 4 months suddenly rearranged itself into something colder. The passenger door he always opened, the iced tea waiting before every event, the thoughtful conversations during long drives, the evenings we shared silent dinners while overlooking the skyline. I had mistaken professionalism for affection, kindness for intimacy, habit for hope. Tears threatened to rise, but years of teaching children had taught me how to smile, even when my heart was breaking. I stepped backward before anyone noticed I had been standing there. My heels made almost no sound against the carpet as I returned to the ballroom. Guests continued laughing beneath glittering chandeliers, completely unaware that my entire world had changed within a single sentence. A photographer waved enthusiastically. "Mrs. Romano, one more picture." I smiled exactly the way they expected. The camera captured a beautiful woman wearing an expensive dress beside the most powerful man in the room. No photograph could capture the invisible distance that had just appeared between us, and no one noticed that while everyone else celebrated the perfect marriage, I had quietly begun planning how to disappear from it. When we finally returned to the Romano estate, the city was still glowing beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but something inside me had already gone dark. Ethan loosened his tie as he stepped into the foyer, thanking the staff with the same calm courtesy he always showed them. He glanced toward me and offered a faint smile. "Long night." I nodded, because trusting my voice felt dangerous. If I spoke, I was afraid every carefully hidden crack inside me would become visible. He studied me for a second longer. "Are you feeling all right?" 4 simple words. 4 words that only hours earlier would have warmed my heart. Now they sounded like lines from a script we had both memorized. "I am just tired," I answered softly. That part at least was true. I climbed the staircase without looking back, feeling his eyes follow me until I disappeared around the corner. Inside my bedroom, I quietly closed the door and leaned against it. staring at the diamond ring resting on my left hand. Under the soft bedside lamp, it sparkled with the same brilliance it had carried on our wedding day. It was beautiful. It was valuable. And suddenly it felt unbelievably heavy. I slipped it off and placed it in my palm. For several minutes, I simply stood there, remembering every small moment that had convinced me this marriage might become real. The cup of hot tea, waiting after difficult charity events. The blanket someone always left on the terrace whenever cold weather surprised me. The birthday cake that appeared, even though I had never mentioned my birthday aloud. I had believed those gestures came from Ethan. Maybe they still had. But kindness did not always mean love. Professional care did not always mean affection. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten the difference. I opened the closet and pulled out the same worn suitcase I had carried from Brooklyn 4 months earlier. It looked strangely out of place among custom furniture and polished hardwood floors. My hands moved almost automatically, folding sweaters, jeans, sketchbooks, old lesson plans from my classroom, and the framed photograph of my 4th grade students standing proudly beside our mural. None of the designer dresses stayed, none of the expensive jewelry, none of the gifts purchased for the role of Mrs. Romano. Those belonged to the life everyone believed I wanted. Around midnight, there was a gentle knock at my door. "Claire?" Ethan's voice remained calm on the other side. "Are you awake?" I closed my eyes. Every instinct begged me to open the door and ask him why. Or why he remembered my favorite tea. Why he always noticed when I skipped lunch. Why he looked disappointed whenever charity events ended and we drove home in silence. But another voice reminded me of the sentence I had overheard. "She is just my cover wife. I could survive many things. Living as someone's carefully managed illusion was not one of them." "I am already asleep," I answered, barely above a whisper. A long silence followed. Finally he said, "Good night, Claire." His footsteps faded down the hallway. I waited another hour before carrying my suitcase downstairs. The mansion felt enormous after midnight. Every polished hallway echoed softly beneath my footsteps. The grandfather clock in the library marked 1 o'clock as I entered Ethan's private office. Moonlight spilled across his desk through tall windows overlooking the river. I carefully placed the wedding ring in the center of a leather notebook. Beside it, I left a single handwritten sentence. "Thank you for giving me a choice when we first met. Tonight, I am choosing myself. I did not ask for money. I did not ask for explanations. Some endings become smaller when too many words are added." As I reached the front door, the elderly housekeeper quietly stepped from the hallway. She looked at my suitcase, then at my face, understanding far more than I had spoken. "Should I wake Mr. Romano?" she asked gently. I forced a smile, through eyes that refused to stay dry. "No, please let him sleep." She hesitated before opening the door for me. Cool autumn air rushed inside, carrying the distant sound of taxis and the faint scent of rain. I stepped onto the front walkway with nothing except one suitcase, and the life I had almost forgotten belonged to me. Behind me stood one of the most guarded homes in New York. Ahead of me waited complete uncertainty. As the taxi disappeared through the front gates, I never noticed the security camera above the entrance quietly recording every second of my departure, or the red notification light that had already begun flashing on Ethan Romano's private phone upstairs. The first thing that woke Ethan was not the sunrise pouring through the windows of his bedroom. It was the sharp vibration of his phone at 6:15 in the morning. He reached for it without opening his eyes, expecting another market report or a schedule update from his executive assistant. Instead, a security notification filled the screen. Main entrance activity, timestamp, 1:18 a.m. He frowned and tapped the recording. The black and white footage showed the front doors opening slowly beneath the estate lights. Claire stepped outside, carrying the same weathered suitcase she had brought with her on the day they signed the contract. She paused for only a second, looked back at the mansion, and climbed into a waiting yellow taxi. Ethan sat upright so quickly that the sheets slipped to the floor. He replayed the video once, then again. By the 4th time, he noticed the detail that made his stomach tighten. She never looked angry. She looked disappointed. He was already pulling on yesterday's shirt before he realized he had skipped breakfast for the first time in years. Downstairs, the house felt strangely empty. Staff members greeted him with careful smiles that faded the moment they saw his expression. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper, stood quietly beside the dining room entrance. Ethan stopped in front of her. "Where is Claire?" She lowered her eyes. "She left during the night, sir." "Why was I not informed?" She hesitated. "She asked me not to wake you." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. That sounded exactly like Claire. Even while leaving, she had worried about disturbing someone else's sleep. He walked directly to his office. The diamond ring rested precisely where she had left it. Beside it lay the folded note written in her familiar handwriting. He read it once without moving, then again more slowly. "Thank you for giving me a choice when we first met. Tonight I am choosing myself. No accusations, no demands, no dramatic farewell." Somehow that hurt more than anger ever could. Before he could gather his thoughts, another phone began ringing on his desk. It belonged to Victor Hayes, his longtime chief of security. "Sir," Victor said immediately, "there is something you need to know. Several outside groups have become unusually interested this morning." Ethan's voice remained calm. "Interested in what?" A brief silence followed. "In Mrs. Romano." Ethan looked toward the empty chair, where Claire usually sat whenever she waited for him between meetings. "Explain." Victor continued carefully. "Your marriage made her untouchable. Overnight, people noticed she has left the estate. Rumors travel quickly. They believe she is no longer under your protection." Ethan stared through the office windows toward the city skyline. He understood exactly what Victor meant. New York had always been a city where information moved faster than traffic. One missing woman, one silent departure, one unanswered question. That was enough for ambitious people to start paying attention. Across the river, Claire had no idea any of this was happening. She rented a modest room above a family-owned bakery in Brooklyn, using cash she had quietly saved before the marriage. The apartment smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon instead of imported candles and polished oak. The mattress creaked every time she sat down. The kitchen sink dripped once every few seconds. She should have felt like she had lost everything. Instead, she finally exhaled. She unpacked her sketchbooks onto the tiny wooden table beside the window and stared at the familiar pages filled with children's drawings and lesson ideas. For the first time in months, she felt like Claire Bennett again, instead of Mrs. Romano. Later that afternoon, she walked 3 blocks to the elementary school where she used to teach. The brick building looked exactly the same. Children laughed on the playground while teachers waved from classroom windows. Principal Linda Foster hurried toward her with genuine surprise. "Claire, we heard you married some billionaire and disappeared forever." Claire laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar after so many weeks of pretending. "Life changes unexpectedly." Linda smiled warmly. "Well, your classroom is still waiting if you ever decide to come home." Claire looked through the hallway windows at colorful paintings taped across the walls. For the first time since leaving the mansion, hope quietly returned. She believed she had stepped away from one complicated chapter and into a simpler life. She did not realize that somewhere across Manhattan, Ethan Romano had already canceled every meeting on his calendar while looking at the empty wedding ring on his desk. And outside his office, people were beginning to whisper that the woman who had vanished before sunrise had suddenly become the most important person in the city. Ethan had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without raising his voice. He had watched markets collapse, competitors betray him, and powerful men panic across polished conference tables. None of it had unsettled him the way an empty chair beside his breakfast table did that Tuesday morning. Her favorite mug still rested inside the kitchen cabinet exactly where she had left it. The small jar of honey she insisted tasted better than sugar remained beside the tea kettle. Even the fresh flowers near the dining room window had begun to wilt, because Claire had always been the one who quietly replaced them before anyone noticed. He had spent 4 months believing routines were meaningless. Now every missing routine felt like an accusation. Victor entered the study, carrying a leather folder filled with reports. "We found where she is staying," he said carefully. Ethan looked up immediately. "Is she safe?" Victor blinked, surprised that safety had become the first question instead of location. "As far as we can tell, yes. She rented a small apartment above a bakery in Brooklyn. She visited her former school yesterday afternoon." Ethan released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "Good." Victor remained silent for several seconds before adding, Do you want us to bring her back? Ethan's expression hardened. She is not a package. Victor nodded once. Understood. Ethan stood and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Morning traffic crawled across the bridges while ferries carved white lines through the river. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Claire was rebuilding a life without him. The realization settled heavily across his shoulders. He reached into his jacket pocket and discovered something unexpected. A folded grocery receipt? Claire had slipped it into his pocket 3 weeks earlier, after teasing him for forgetting to buy coffee beans during one of their rare afternoons together outside official events. On the back, she had written, in neat handwriting, "Do not work all weekend. The coffee can wait." He stared at those 7 words much longer than he should have. At the bakery in Brooklyn, Claire tied a pale blue apron around her waist after the owner insisted she accept free breakfast in exchange for helping arrange pastries inside the display case before school interviews began. The warm scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh sourdough wrapped around her like an old memory. Nobody recognized her as the woman from society magazines. Here she was simply another neighbor smiling at customers carrying strollers, backpacks, and paper coffee cups. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Around noon, Principal Linda Foster called with unexpected news. A 4th-grade teacher had accepted a position in Boston, leaving an immediate opening. "The board would love to have you back," Linda said warmly. Claire looked through the bakery window at children laughing as they hurried home for lunch. "I would love that too." For the first time since leaving the Romano estate, she allowed herself to imagine a future measured by school semesters instead of charity galas. Meanwhile, inside a private conference room overlooking Central Park, several influential investors waited impatiently for Ethan to begin the quarterly strategy meeting that had been scheduled for months. Instead of reviewing financial projections, Ethan quietly closed the presentation folder. "Reschedule everything." Confused glances filled the room. One executive cleared his throat. "Sir, this meeting involves nearly $2 billion in pending agreements." Ethan's voice remained calm. "Then they can wait one more day." No one argued. They had never seen him postpone business for any reason. Victor caught up with him in the hallway. "Where are you going?" Ethan adjusted his coat while walking toward the elevator. "Brooklyn. Should I prepare security?" Ethan shook his head. "No convoy. No headlines. No announcements." "Just you?" Victor asked. Ethan paused before answering. "I spent months asking Claire to play the role of my wife. Today, I am going to ask if she will simply speak to me." As the elevator doors closed, he glanced once more at the folded grocery receipt still resting in his hand. It struck him with painful clarity that the woman he had once considered part of a carefully planned arrangement had somehow become the only person capable of making the largest house he had ever owned feel unbearably empty. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Romano realized that losing someone's trust was far more frightening than losing control. Brooklyn looked smaller than Ethan remembered. The streets were lined with neighborhood diners, family-owned stores, and children racing bicycles along cracked sidewalks that had seen decades of ordinary life. Nobody looked twice at the dark SUV parked half a block away, because Ethan had insisted on leaving the larger security detail behind. He stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a simple charcoal coat instead of one of his custom-tailored suits. For the first time in years, he wanted to arrive as a man instead of a reputation. Inside the bakery, Claire laughed quietly at something an elderly customer had said while sliding a warm loaf of sourdough across the counter. The sound stopped him before he reached the door. It had been weeks since he had heard her laugh without cameras nearby. It was softer than he remembered, real, unrehearsed. She looked different too. Her hair was tied back loosely. A little flour dusted one sleeve of her sweater, and there was color in her cheeks that had disappeared during the endless charity events. She looked like the woman he had first met across that conference table, except now she looked lighter somehow, as though she had finally set down a burden she had been carrying for months. The bell above the bakery door chimed gently as Ethan stepped inside. Claire looked up automatically, her smile fading the instant their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. The aroma of fresh cinnamon and brewed coffee filled the silence between them, while customers continued chatting, completely unaware that two lives had just collided again. Claire thanked the customer in front of her, finished wrapping a paper bag, and waited until the last person left before walking around the counter. "You found me," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "I hoped I would." She folded her hands together, not out of fear, but to keep them from trembling. "Why are you here?" Ethan looked around the small bakery before answering. "To make sure you were safe." A faint, almost sad smile crossed her face. "I am safe." He noticed the tiny apartment key hanging from a blue ribbon around her wrist, the flower on her sleeve, and the stack of lesson plans resting beside the cash register. Pieces of the life she had chosen, pieces of the life he had interrupted months earlier. "Claire," he began carefully, "can we talk?" She glanced toward the owner, who quietly disappeared into the kitchen with remarkable timing, leaving them alone without asking questions. Claire walked toward a small table beside the front window and sat down across from him. Rain began tapping softly against the glass, blurring the afternoon traffic outside. Ethan rested his hands on the wooden table. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he did not know how to begin. Negotiations had always come easily. This felt nothing like a negotiation. "I read your note," he finally said. "I deserved every word." Claire looked down at the steaming mug between her hands. There were not many words. That was the hardest part. She met his eyes again, calm but distant. Silence says enough when someone has already heard the truth. Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him. He understood exactly what she meant. "You heard something that night," he said quietly. She nodded. "I did." "Then you know why you left." Claire took a slow breath. "I know what I heard." Another silence stretched between them. Outside, a school bus rolled past, children laughing through open windows while autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. The ordinary beauty of the moment made everything inside the bakery feel painfully honest. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Please tell me what you believe happened." Claire looked at him for several long seconds before speaking. "I believed that somewhere along the way, I forgot our marriage was temporary." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected months of hope she no longer trusted. "I believed your kindness meant something more than obligation. Then I heard you tell someone that I was only your cover wife. In that moment, every memory changed." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He wanted to explain everything immediately, but he knew explanations offered too soon often sounded like excuses. Claire stood slowly and picked up her empty mug. "If I was only your cover wife," she asked with heartbreaking calm, "why did you come all the way to Brooklyn just to find me?" Ethan looked up at her, realizing there was no business strategy, carefully prepared speech, or carefully negotiated agreement capable of answering the question that mattered most. The question lingered between us long after the rain began falling harder against the bakery window. Ethan did not answer immediately, and somehow that silence frightened me more than another carefully rehearsed explanation would have. He looked down at the wooden table, turning the untouched coffee cup slowly with one hand, as though searching for words he had never needed before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the effortless confidence that had always surrounded him. "Because I realized I could not breathe the moment I knew you were gone." I wanted to believe him. Every part of me wanted those words to erase everything I had heard that night. But broken trust does not disappear because someone suddenly discovers the right sentence. "That is not an answer," I said quietly. "It is how you feel now." I asked why you said what you said. Ethan nodded slowly. "You deserve the truth." Outside, another customer reached for the bakery door, noticed the handwritten "closed for inventory" sign hanging in the window, and continued down the sidewalk. The small room grew even quieter. Ethan folded his hands together before meeting my eyes again. The man speaking with me that night was not simply an advisor. He has worked beside me for years, but recently I discovered confidential information had been leaving my organization. Someone close to me was reporting everything they heard. I listened without interrupting. "The only thing I knew for certain," he continued, "was that the conversations would never remain private. I needed whoever was listening to believe our marriage meant nothing beyond appearances." My heart tightened. "So you chose to convince everyone that I meant nothing?" Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second. "I chose to convince them that my feelings could never become my weakness." I remembered the exact tone of his voice from that night. Calm, certain, unshakable. It had sounded painfully real, because in that moment, it had been meant for someone else to hear. "You should have told me," I whispered. "I know." He did not argue. He did not defend himself. I believed, the less you knew, the safer you would be. Every unnecessary conversation created another risk. Every secret shared with you became another burden you never asked to carry. I stared at the rain sliding down the window beside us. Instead, you gave me a different burden. Ethan lowered his head slightly. Yes, the honesty in that single word caught me off guard. There was no attempt to excuse the damage, no effort to minimize my pain, just acceptance. "The morning after you left," he continued, "I found your note beside your wedding ring." His voice became quieter. "I have negotiated with presidents, investors, and competitors. Nothing prepared me for one sentence written by someone who had already stopped asking me to explain." I felt tears threatening again, but I refused to let them fall. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked. It was not hearing those words. It was realizing I had built an entire future out of moments that suddenly felt imaginary. Ethan looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not authority, not control, regret. None of those moments were imaginary, Claire. I almost laughed through the ache in my chest. "How can you say that?" He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded a small piece of paper that had been folded so many times its edges had begun to soften. It was the grocery receipt I had slipped into his pocket weeks earlier with the words, "Do not work all weekend. The coffee can wait." "I never threw this away," he said quietly. "I carried it every day, because every time I reached into my pocket, it reminded me that someone existed who cared whether I rested. Nobody had ever done that for me before." My eyes fell to the faded handwriting. I had forgotten I even wrote it. Ethan continued before I could speak. "The tea I asked the staff to prepare, the flowers, shortening the events when your feet hurt, remembering your birthday. Every one of those things was real. The contract required a public marriage. It never required me to notice the little things that made you smile." I looked at him for a long moment, trying to separate the man sitting across from me from the voice I had overheard behind those half-closed doors. For the first time since leaving the estate, I realized both versions of Ethan had been telling the truth at different moments, and somehow that made everything far more complicated than either of us had ever imagined. The rain had almost stopped by the time Ethan stood from the table, but neither of us moved toward the door. The silence between us no longer felt sharp. It felt fragile, like something waiting to see whether it would become trust again or disappear forever. Before either of us could speak, Ethan's phone vibrated across the wooden table. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since I had known him, I watched the color drain from his face. He rejected the call. It rang again immediately, then a third time. Finally, he answered without taking his eyes off me. "What happened?" His voice was calm, but I noticed his shoulders become impossibly still. Victor spoke quickly on the other end. I could not hear every word, only scattered fragments. "Meeting, information confirmed. Board members demanding an immediate decision. They know you left Manhattan." Ethan listened without interrupting. When the call ended, he placed the phone face down and released a slow breath. "You should go," I said quietly. "Your people need you." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. "They can wait." I shook my head. "They have never waited before." A faint smile touched his face. "That is exactly the problem." He walked toward the front window, watching afternoon traffic move through the wet streets. "For years, I believed every important decision involved money, influence, or strategy. I organized my entire life around protecting an empire that never asked whether I was happy." He turned back toward me. "Then I met an elementary school teacher who thought grocery lists belonged in my coat pocket. Despite everything, I smiled. You still forgot the coffee beans." He actually laughed. It was quiet and brief, but unmistakably genuine. I did. The sound surprised both of us. Moments later, the bakery owner stepped out from the kitchen, carrying a tray of fresh cookies. She smiled warmly without asking questions. "These just came out of the oven. They taste better while they are still warm." Ethan thanked her politely. After she disappeared again, he picked up one cookie, broke it in half, and handed one piece to me. Months earlier, I would have thought nothing of such a simple gesture. Now it reminded me that real life was built from ordinary moments, instead of grand promises. Ethan rested his elbows lightly on the table. Victor called because the board wants me to make a public statement. They believe our separation has created uncertainty. What will you tell them? I asked. He answered without hesitation. The truth. I frowned slightly. The truth has consequences. So does hiding behind the wrong words. He reached into his pocket and slowly removed the folded copy of our marriage agreement. I recognized every page immediately. We had both signed it 4 months earlier, inside a law office overlooking Fifth Avenue. Without saying anything dramatic, Ethan placed the document in the center of the table. Then, 1 page at a time, he tore it neatly down the middle. The sound of paper separating seemed louder than the traffic outside. I stared at the torn pages in disbelief. Ethan, he met my eyes before I could finish. I spent months treating this agreement like the most important document in my life. Another page separated cleanly beneath his hands. It is not. He gathered every torn piece into a small stack and set it aside. If protecting this contract requires me to lose the one person who made me remember how to live outside conference rooms and security briefings, then it was never worth protecting. I searched his face for hesitation and found none. There was no performance, no audience, no photographers waiting outside. Only the quiet certainty of a man making a choice that could not be undone. My heart wanted to believe him. But healing does not arrive all at once, simply because someone finally says the right thing. I cannot promise everything goes back to the way it was, I admitted softly. Ethan nodded. I do not want it to. You do not? No. His voice remained steady. I want the chance to build something honest, instead of asking you to return to something that already broke. Outside, the clouds slowly parted, allowing a narrow ribbon of late afternoon sunlight to spill across the bakery floor. Neither of us noticed that Victor's final message remained unopened on Ethan's phone, waiting silently on the dark screen with only 6 words that would soon change everything again. The board refuses to accept your decision. 3 months later, spring arrived quietly in New York. Cherry blossoms lined the streets outside the elementary school, where I had returned to teaching. And every afternoon, my classroom filled with the familiar sounds of children proudly showing me paintings, covered in impossible colors and oversized dreams. Life had become wonderfully ordinary again. I drove my old Honda Civic across the Brooklyn Bridge every morning, carried coffee that was usually too hot, and spent evenings grading art projects at the tiny apartment above the bakery. Sometimes I caught myself looking toward the street whenever a black SUV passed. Sometimes I wondered whether choosing peace had meant giving up the possibility of love. Ethan never appeared without warning again. He never called repeatedly. He never asked anyone to persuade me. Instead, every Friday morning, a fresh bouquet of wildflowers arrived at the school office, with no signature attached. The receptionist smiled each week and simply handed them to me. I always knew who had sent them, because they were never expensive roses or extravagant arrangements. They were the simple flowers I had once pointed out during a drive through the countryside, saying they looked happier because nobody expected them to be perfect. Then, on the final Friday in April, Principal Linda Foster stepped into my classroom after the last student had gone home. "Claire," she said with an amused smile, "there is someone waiting in the auditorium." He reserved it for exactly 5 minutes and promised not to interrupt school. Curiosity carried me down the quiet hallway. The auditorium doors stood slightly open. Inside, there were no reporters, no photographers, no security teams filling every aisle. Only Ethan stood alone on the stage beneath the soft glow of the work lights. He wore a simple navy suit, without any of the symbols of power that had once followed him everywhere. When I walked inside, he stepped down from the stage instead of waiting for me to come closer. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Linda told me you would only agree if she believed it mattered." "She knows me well," I answered. Ethan smiled gently. "She does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his jacket and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "Yesterday, I resigned from every board that required me to treat people like strategies instead of human beings." I stared at him in surprise. "You resigned?" He nodded. "Some people called it the worst business decision of my life. Was it?" He shook his head. "No. The worst decision was believing I had to choose between success and honesty." He handed me the paper. It was not another contract. It was a letter announcing the creation of a foundation that would provide art programs for public schools across New York, beginning with the district where I taught. At the bottom was one handwritten sentence. You once told me children deserve someone who believes in their future before they believe in themselves. Thank you for teaching me the same lesson. I looked up, unable to speak. Ethan took one slow breath. Claire, months ago I asked you to marry me because I needed a convincing story. Today I am asking nothing except the chance to earn your trust one ordinary day at a time. If all we ever become is two people sharing coffee after work, I will still be grateful that you gave me another conversation. My eyes filled before I could stop them. You really are different. He smiled, the kind of smile that no camera had ever captured. No, I finally stopped pretending to be the version of myself everyone else expected. I reached into my bag and pulled out something I had carried for weeks, without understanding why. The diamond wedding ring. I placed it gently in his hand. His expression fell for the briefest moment, before I closed his fingers around it, and whispered, "If we ever wear this again, it will not be because of a contract." Hope returned to his eyes. Only because we choose it. I nodded. Only because we choose it. 1 year later, our wedding was held in the small botanical garden where my students had painted landscapes every spring. There were no headlines announcing a powerful alliance, no speeches about influence, and no carefully rehearsed photographs. My fourth graders scattered flower petals along the garden path, while the bakery owner cried through the ceremony, and Principal Foster laughed every time I forgot my place in the vows. Ethan slipped the same ring onto my finger, but this time it felt astonishingly light. As we walked beneath the afternoon sunlight, I realized the safest place in New York had never been his estate, his fortune, or the walls surrounding his world. It was the quiet certainty that love chosen freely will always be stronger than any promise signed out of fear.